Okay, well, welcome to this one-on-one chat with one of my favorites, Dr. Gregory Boyd. Greg hails from Minnesota in the US. So welcome, Greg. Great to see you.
Thanks, Wayne. Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity.
And so for those who don't know Greg, particularly in Australia, I guess, Greg does hail from Minnesota. He studied in philosophy. He studied obviously theology. His Masters of Divinity was at Yale,
Yeah.
your Masters, and then your PhD from Princeton. And along for me with Dr. N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, Gordon Fee, these guys. Greg is one of my favorite scholars.
Well,
And
thank you. Appreciate that.
I think the late 80s, you pioneered Woodland Hills Church, where you're still pastoring, and which is what I love about you, Greg. You've kept your foot on the ground with people and pastoring and leading your church as a teaching pastor. So the perspective that brings, I think, is so invaluable in keeping that connection at the great
I
church
agree.
you have there. The other thing I remember, 2010, Greg was listed among the 20 most influential living Christian scholars. And when I
I don't
saw
know who came
that,
up with that poll, but yeah, I don't know who came up with that, but I've heard
yeah, when I
that.
saw that, I was glad it actually said living, and you probably were too.
I'm not dead yet.
Yeah. So Greg, you live in the Minneapolis St. Paul area of Minnesota, and
Right?
obviously a really tough area last year for COVID. When COVID hit, probably one of the most difficult areas in the U.S. to be living in, that northeast of the U.S. And then on top of that, ground zero for the George Floyd, that terrible incident with George Floyd,
Right.
right in your area. And then, of course, the elections, the lead up to the elections, the everything that followed on from the elections last year. You guys had one heck of a year last year.
I would
And
not want to repeat it for any reason. I mean, 2020 was one that you just write off. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it was tough, but you know, when things are rough and things looking crappy and things are going downhill, God is there, and our job is to partner with God, whatever the circumstances are in the culture. And so, yeah, a lot of terrible things were happening, but I see God doing a lot of good things too.
absolutely. And we can't ignore that. There's some great things happening in the world as well. But I guess in how people reacted and responded, and particularly in the church, some church leaders, how they reacted and responded in that period of the pandemic last year, and with the George Floyd incident. And I guess during the election periods, were you surprised in how people reacted and responded, or was it for you just something that you already knew was just bubbling below the surface in people, and that this just brought out
Well,
some of the worst in humanity and the worst of the church?
I think both of those are true. The seeds of this have been bubbling for a long time. We could talk about the long history behind that. But it's also true that there's some unique, surprising elements to what was happening in 2020. I was, on the one hand, kind of surprised and impressed by how much the George Floyd, that moment caught on, and how it became kind of a symbol for white supremacy. And you get protests going on all around the globe over this. And so I was really impressed by how many people got on board with this. I was impressed with here in the Twin Cities. And we started having meetings with between white and black pastors, and other non-white pastors as well. And I was surprised at how many white folks stepped up to the plate. Now, I don't know if they're still around and if they're still allies on race and stuff, but people came out of the woodwork. Usually these meetings, we would have maybe 10 or 20 pastors. But after the George Floyd thing, we had a couple hundred. I mean, it was just, so that was really good. Yeah, I felt like the church took a step forward in taking a stand against racism. But I also there's a lot of disappointing stories too. I know three white guys who lost their jobs because they dared to really weigh in on race after the George Floyd murder, and saying, hey, there's something real here, and we have to be in solidarity with people of color, and they got fired. And so when there's moments like this, you take the stress of COVID, the stress of the whole, it wasn't just George Floyd, but the whole police on violence or the violent police issue with communities of color, and all that together, what it does is it brings out the best and the worst. And I think that's what we're seeing as a result of that.
Yeah. I read a great quote just in the last 2 weeks from Pastor Brian Zart. But do you, or we seem to be sort of sinking into a bit more of a culture war at the moment. Again, some of this stuff's probably been bubbling under the surface, and certainly from my perspective, there almost seems to be in the church people who are building bigger walls rather than tearing down walls. But Brian wrote this, most of us are scripted to think through the echo chambers that so many inhabit, that life is a game and the purpose of life is to win. This is the way that seems right, but the divine truth is that life is a gift and the purpose of life is living to love well. And again, from my perspective, we seem to be increasingly shifting into these tribal echo chambers at the expense of loving well. And how can we intentionally avoid falling into that trap? First of all, do you see that as well? Then how can we avoid falling into that trap as the church?
It's frightful how quickly and how thoroughly this is happening, at least here in the States, where people are falling into these echo chambers, the self-selecting internet, and now, with the logarithms that we know that Facebook and others do, where they just kind of bait you and they pull you further along into more extreme views, because that's what keeps, you on the site. That's how they make their money. We're no longer the consumers. We're the product. They're harvesting our attention. And the consumers are the folks who are making the bucks off of it. They just want to use our attention to, make money. And so when we let that happen, we end up always getting our beliefs confirmed, never getting challenged. And the more that happens, the harder the more inflexible our brain gets. We eventually lose our capacity to understand other points of view because we're never flexing that muscle. And eventually we lose the interest in even wanting to understand the other view. We just hate them. And we join the people who just are, congratulating ourselves on how right we are and how stupid they are. And that's what they're doing to you. And now no one is working for the common good. In fact, we don't even have a common shared reality. I'll tell you, one thing I'm sure of is that I'm really glad that my hope is in Jesus Christ. And the last couple of years has really solidified that, because I would be in despair if it wasn't for my hope in Christ. Because I don't see any way that a democracy can survive even one generation if you don't have shared trust, a trusted institution, some shared sources of fact, some shared reality, and some shared convictions about decency. If you don't have that, totalitarian regimes can survive without that. They just rely on propaganda. But democracies can't. And it doesn't bode well for the future. I don't know how we walk back from this thing, So I'm glad my hope is in Jesus Christ. Otherwise, I'd be a very pessimistic person. Amen. So I totally agree that we've gotten siloed. I guess all I say about that is that we have to wake up to the reality that we're being played. We're being played. On the one hand, we're being played by social media, who's harvesting our attention to make money for the already rich people. We're being played that way. But there's a spiritual component to this. We're being played by the principalities and powers. And so Paul says in Ephesians 6 that our struggle is never against flesh and blood, but it's against principalities and powers and rulers and authorities in dark realms. And the dynamic there is that we're supposed to be resisting the powers who are always trying to get us to demonize flesh and blood, to demonize the other human being. Because if we're shooting at other human beings, we're not shooting at them.
Yeah.
And this is their play. They want to. We talk about how maybe China and Russia and other countries are playing us right now. They're bots, and they throw in these controversial advertisements and on these wedge issues, and they're trying to divide us. Well, that's what the powers are doing, and the powers are just using them, as one of the ways to do this. And we're being played. We're being suckered right into it. We're buying everything that they're selling, and it's destroying us. But at least for the church, we've got to realize that the only way to fight the powers is to refuse to not love another human being. Our call is to love even our worst enemies, right? And that's because that's the way Jesus loved us. You know, we're to live in love as Christ loved us and gave his life for us. So our job is to, whoever the person is, whatever their opinions are, whatever their philosophy is, whatever their politics are, we may love it, we may hate it, they may be giving us flowers, or they may be holding a gun to our head. It doesn't matter. Our job is to love like Abba Father does, to show that we're children of the Father in heaven. Like the sun shines, like the rain falls, to love indiscriminately. And then in doing that, you're resisting the powers and resist anything that would cause you to dehumanize the other person, see them as a this or that, rather than the unique human being that they are. We can't let ourselves get sucked into the silo of the internet. Our unique call as kingdom people is gone the minute that happens, because our gospel will be co-opted by whatever echo chamber you got sucked into.
Yeah, so true, Greg, so true. And I totally agree. Let me just quote something out of the first book of yours I read, Repenting of Religion, which I've read probably 3 times now. Love it.
Oh,
and it's love and judgment represent 2 antithetical ways of living. We either live out of our union with God and thus with our fellow sisters and brothers, or we live out of ourselves at the center, in separation from our sisters and brothers. We either live by God's righteousness or our own. Which way we live ultimately comes down to this decision, which I think is so important. Shall we eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil or not? Or shall we eat in grateful dependence on God or not? Shall we let God be judge, or shall we try to be judge? And so shall we live in God's mercy and thus give God's mercy, or shall we pass judgment as though we were God and thus live under God's judgment? And for me, Satan has no new tricks in his bag. He's been pulling this same con on humanity throughout history. And so why for you, and I think for me too, is it important for us to understand these first few chapters of Genesis in how it relates to us in 2021, in the 21st century? This whole thing of understanding which tree we're feeding from and what that means.
Yeah, I think Genesis 3 is just so profound. It is just so divinely inspired. It has so much wisdom packed into it. I think it's so profound because it's paradigmatic. So here we have Eden, and in the center of Eden are 2 trees. And it's important to note that they're in the center of Eden. In the middle, it specifies that. The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's a way of saying that life in the garden revolves around trusting God's provision of life and honoring God's prohibition not to claim to know good and evil. I see the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as just being God's loving no trespassing sign. He's saying, I made you in my image, so be in my image in terms of how you love and take care of the earth and the animal kingdom, and in terms of how you love others. Okay, reflect my character in that way, but don't try to be in my image in terms of what you think you know. Let me handle all the judgment. And so the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that idiom there in the ancient Near East has a connotation of to know good and evil is like you get to define it. You're the authority on it. We have I call it the omniscience mechanism. We think we know so much about people and things. And so what happens is we all of us, instinctively, some of this is our fallen nature, some of this is our conditioning, but we assess things. We're always evaluating. If we don't usually notice it because it's too close to us, it's like the air we breathe, but we have a running commentary going on in our head about other people all the time. A gossip column. I wasn't aware of this until I guess it was the late 90s, and I shared this at the beginning of Repenting of Religion. But I was out, shopping with my wife, and she loves to go shopping, and I hate to go shopping, so I get tired really quick. And so then I asked her if I could take a break, sit in the middle of this mall while she goes and runs around. And so I'm just people watching, and at some point, all of a sudden, the Spirit of God just wakes me up to puts a megaphone to my brain and lets me hear what I'm thinking. And what I'm thinking is, oh man, you really need that extra cheeseburger there, don't you, buddy? Oh, we know when a girl who dresses like that, we know what attention she's trying to get. And I got this commentary going on. And then I felt like the Holy Spirit just said to me, I don't recall giving you the job description of being arbiter of good taste and health and everything else that you have an opinion about. Where's that in your job description? Answer is nowhere. Well, what is your job description? And my job description is to live in love as Christ loved me and gave his life for me, before it. To live in that love. That means there's never a moment when I'm not supposed to be manifesting that love. These are people I'm supposed to be loving. And see, and here's what I didn't realize until this moment when I was having this experience. But the reason why I think eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the original sin of the Bible. It's the thing that makes everything go wrong. And it's because judgment and love are antithetical. To love someone, and the Bible defines love by pointing us to Calvary, 1 John 3:16. Here's how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. So when you love somebody, you're ascribing worth to them at cost to yourself. You are worth this, and I'll demonstrate this by what I'm willing to sacrifice for you. That's what God does for us on Calvary. He shows that we have unsurpassable worth because he paid an unsurpassable price for us. Judgment is the opposite of that. Judgment takes worth from another and ascribes it to yourself. And that's why we judge. It makes us feel better. Whatever loser I may be, at least I'm not like that guy.
Yeah.
Oh, I may be, pretty dumb, but at least I'm not that stupid. And by cutting other people off of the knees, we feel a little bit taller. All behavior has a purpose, a function, and the function of judgment is stroking your ego, and it's idolatry. It's absolutely idolatry. And so that's why I really believe our job is to leave all judgment to God, to announce that God's not holding anyone's sins against them, 2 Corinthians 5, and to implore people to accept their reconciliation, to accept their forgiveness. But whatever we think we see in another person's life, unless they've invited us in and asked us to have an opinion to help them live out the kingdom life, and we all need people like that. But if you're not invited in, then you're only allowed one opinion of people, and that is that they were worth Jesus dying for. So Paul said, I resolved to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's all you need to know.
Yeah. You
were worth Jesus dying for. End of story.
Yeah, beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Do you think that is this whole thing of continuing to feed from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, from this tree of judgment, is the reason people today seem to have to prove that they're right, that, Greg, my rightness is better than your rightness.
Absolutely.
And I have to prove it to you. And people seem to be getting their self-esteem from being right or being around other people that simply agree with their rightness. Is that evidence, do you think, that we're still feeding from the wrong tree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Here's the thing. Almost all human social groups are idolatrous. And the reason I say that is this. An idol is anything that plays a role in our life that only God should play. And I really believe that the core of our faith is that we are to get all of our identity, our sense of worth, our sense of significance, our sense of purpose, our sense of being okay, and our sense of being secure. We should have that out of our relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And if that need is being met, then I don't need to try to get that need met by how I impress you or how right I am or whatever. But if I'm not getting that need met out of my relationship with Christ, well, that need's going to have to get met. And the likely candidate, especially among religious people, if you're just a run-of-the-mill pagan, you might get life by the harem that you get or, whatever. But if you're religiously inclined, you get life by thinking you're saved. You're part of the saved club. You're part of the holy club. And this is how human groups generally do it. We are the people who, and now there's some bragging rights. We are the people who do this, as opposed to those heretics who do this. We are the ones who, we're the exceptional, we're the this. And so you get life by belonging to the group of people who do the right things and who believe the right things. And you may confess that you're not perfect, but at least you're not like those people out there. Mm-hmm. That is just an idolatrous holy club. The kingdom, I think, is the kingdom starts when we admit that whatever we see in someone else's life is a mere dust particle compared to the tree trunk of sin in our own eyes. Yeah. And if you adopt that mindset, you can't ever look down at somebody. You can only look up. Yeah. You are the worst of sinners.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. Let me read another quote of yours from The Myth of a Christian Religion. And you wrote this: the revolutions of the world have always been about one group trying to wrest power from another. The revolution Jesus launched, however, is far more radical, for it declares the quest for power over others to be as hopeless as it is sinful. Jesus' kingdom revolts against this sinful quest for power over others. I think you've already touched on that a little. Choosing instead to exercise power under others. It's a revolution of humble, self-sacrificial, loving service. It always looks like Jesus dying on Calvary for the very people who crucified him. And I just wonder if you could quickly unpack what you mean by this power over, power under thing, and then what you mean by this thing that the kingdom is always looks like Jesus dying on Calvary for the very people who crucified him. And
sure.
That's what should influence our witness to the world.
Right.
I see it. But could you unpack some of that?
Oh, sure. Well, the power over, power under distinction, I talk about this in Myth of a Christian Nation. But it's the way the world operates is by everyone tries to get power over everybody else, right? So it's been a game of king of the hill. And the kind of power we've always lusted for is the power to protect ourselves, the power to get our way, the power to further our self-interest, and the power to defeat our enemies. That's kind of power humans have always lusted for, and that's what we've always projected onto the gods, that kind of power. The gods are set aside not by their character, but by the fact that they got more power than we've got. And then what religion does is religion tries to think of ways, how can we, appease them or serve them so that we can get some of that power to work on our behalf, so that now we can fight for God and country. Americans think that we invented that slogan, but that's the oldest slogan in the pagan book. Everyone fights for God and country, some deity or other, and try to court their favor. Well, along comes Jesus, and he completely blows apart that whole paradigm. He says, in all of his teachings, it comes out in different ways, but he says, about the Gentiles, some people lord over others, and they're called the benefactors. Lucky you get to be on top. But I'm telling you, in the kingdom, the first shall be last, the greatest shall be the least. The one who serves is better than the one who is served. He just turns everything on its head and reveals a kingdom where those hierarchies just don't have any kind of a place. It just blows that whole power paradigm sky high. And now what's revealed is that Paul says that the cross is the power and the wisdom of God. To the world it's foolishness, but to us it's the power of God. Man, this is just the most incredible thing. Because if you look at a crucified guy on the cross, nothing could seem more powerless than that person. You're crucified. You're dying up there, a slow, suffocating death. But Paul says that's the power of God. When God flexes his muscle, it looks like him getting crucified out of love for the very people who are crucifying, which ultimately is all of us. I mean, it's a power of influential, self-sacrificial love. It's the power of love to draw and to transform hearts. It's the greatest power in the universe if you ever give it a chance to work. But if you're addicted to violence the way we tend to be, you never get a chance. As soon as someone crosses the wrong way, you blow them apart. You don't try to love them. But so I really believe that our job is not to try to run the world. Just because we're followers of Jesus doesn't make us any smarter on how to run a country. It might make us dumber, actually, but it won't make us smarter. But that's not our job. Our job is to manifest an altogether different kingdom, an altogether beautiful kingdom, to show people a different way of living. And I say that it always looks like the cross because it's always about sacrifice. What you're willing, all of life is kind of an answer to this question. How much of my good fortune am I going to cash in on? And how much am I going to use for the purpose of advancing something greater than myself, namely the kingdom of God? And the kingdom of God always starts with your first drop of blood. It's with that first pinch. Where does your faith cost you something? Now you're beginning to enter kingdom territory. And it always looks like you're sacrificing for the sake of others, sacrificing for the sake of love. So the kingdom always should have that cruciform kind of character to it. Where you have, professing Christians, but there's no cruciformity to it, there's no humility to it, they're not serving anybody, they're just trying to be right, they're trying to protect themselves, they're trying to pass rights against certain kind of sinners because they want to have the right not to have to serve them or look at them or whatever. There's just nothing kingdom about that. You can call that Christian religion, you can call it whatever, but it's not the kingdom. The kingdom always looks like the cross, and And there you just have religious, pompous claims being made, and they're all self-serving.
Yeah, it's probably a good lead into another question I wanted to ask you, because just in the last few years, for me in particular, I've heard about the third way approach. The kingdom way is a third way approach, and it's our approach to mission. And the alternatives are when we're facing opposition or pushback as the church, whether it be from government, whether it be from people, whether it be persecution, whatever it is, that we're either going to fight, we're going to step up and fight back just the same way other people fight, really.
Right.
Or there's the flight mode where we're just going to put our head in the sand and pray it all goes away, or somebody else does something about it. Or we can follow the Jesus way, the way of the cross. And so this third way, I think a lot of people perhaps haven't even heard of this language. So what does that mean for you?
Well, actually, it can mean different things depending on who's using it. So it has been getting more used commonly, and the result is that it doesn't have as clear meaning as it once had. But originally, the third way approach was coined by the Anabaptists, and it was their way of saying, we don't accept the polarities of the culture. You know, the culture says, do we pay taxes or not? You know, they come to Jesus with that question. And they do it because they know that, you know, that's a very divisive question in the first century. People had very passionate convictions about whether you should pay taxes or not to the Roman government. And so however Jesus would answer that question, it would divide the audience in half. But Jesus, he always found a third way. It's like, he says, bring me a coin. And then he says, whose image is on this coin? Of course, all Jews were offended by the image of Caesar on coins. They thought that was just idolatry. But so he holds up this coin and says, whose image is it? And they said, Caesar's. He goes, well, if it's got Caesar's image, it must belong to him. Give it to him, for all I care. But here's my word to you, is not to settle that issue. My question is, are you giving to God all that bears his image? And so he has a unique way of taking their worldly questions. You know, help us run the world. Help us fix the world. And he turns it around and says, well, what about you? You know, that one guy comes to Jesus in Luke 12 and says, tell my older brother to share the inheritance. Because the law was screwed up. The law gave all the inheritance to the eldest brother. And then it was just based on his good graces as to whether he'd share any of it or not. It was a terrible law. But the guy says, Jesus, will you use your authority to solve this social problem? And Jesus says, who put me in charge of you? Who made me your lawyer? If I look like your lawyer? And he says, here's what I will tell you. And now he introduces the kingdom. Be careful about all kinds of greed. You know, that's the distinct thing. Are you giving to God what belongs to God? And so I think it's so important that the church we can't let the culture set the table for the conversation. We have to be asking the question, what is our unique kingdom perspective here? And often it's a way that either splits the difference or avoids altogether the binaries of the culture that you're in. Where do you stand? Do you stand here or do you stand there? Well, maybe we stand somewhere kind of from a different vantage point altogether. Which is, I think, how we're supposed to be conducting ourselves.
Yeah. And Greg, if we conduct ourselves that way, and we walk the way of Jesus, and we are supposed to be a people of the way, following his way, whether we call it a third way, whatever we call it, the way of the cross, the way of sacrificial love. A lot of people, I guess, don't grab a hold of that. And so a lot of people are labeling other Christians who are following in the way of love and calling us passive liberals. We're liberals.
Liberals.
I heard a pastor in America the other day, someone sent me a clip saying that people like you and I are apathetic. Because we're just all about the love of God.
Oh, I just want to beat up people like that, man.
And so I guess because some people don't understand, how can we actually advance the kingdom by this third way, by this way of love, by being uncompromising when it comes to Christ and Christ crucified, and seeing people through that lens?
Yeah. You know, it's... I'll answer your question by pointing out one of the major binaries that we are given. The assumption is either you are willing to resort to whatever violence is necessary to protect you and your loved ones, or you're saying do nothing. Go ahead, rape my kids. I don't care. See, Now, between killing somebody and doing nothing, there's a whole universe of possibilities. But if you're addicted to violence, which in America we tend to be, you find your security in violence, well then the only option is, you don't even consider other possible ways of responding. You take off your piece and you pop the guy. And you do it in Jesus' name if you're a Christian. It's just sad. But see, here's the thing: when Jesus says, "Love your enemies and never retaliate," don't leave all judgment to God. Paul says, "You feed your enemies and you give them some drink if they're thirsty. Your job's not for you. Leave that to God." And when he gives that teaching, he's not just like giving us a rule, like here's the rule that you have to obey when someone breaks into your house. He's giving us a lifestyle. And that whole Sermon on the Mount he's saying, lean into this way of living. And so what I encourage people to do is if you find yourself disagreeing with Jesus, because Jesus, when he says love your enemies, he doesn't qualify it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. In fact, the context rules out the possibility that there could be any exceptions to this. Because we're supposed to love like the rain falls and like the sun shines, which means we love indiscriminately. It's not based on the character of the person we're talking about. It's based on the character of Abba Father. And we've got his DNA running through us. And so what if we find that we disagree with Jesus, what if we just assume that we're in the wrong? And let's confess we don't get it. It just doesn't make sense. We think we should just kill whoever breaks into your house, no questions asked. But what if we started loving our enemies in little ways? Because that doesn't happen very often, that someone breaks into your house and threatens you and your loved ones. So can we put that on hold a little bit? And let's start just loving our enemies in little ways. Start praying for the 3 people in your life who are the hardest for you to pray for. I think this is a discipline I think everyone should be doing, because this is loving enemies is a muscle you got to develop. You got to flex this baby. So make it a practice to regularly pray and agree with God that they're what Jesus is dying for. And see, what that does is it begins to change your heart. It begins to change your character. And maybe in 10 years, if someone, God forbid, does break into our house and is threatening us or our loved ones, maybe we'll have developed a kind of character that's such that loving our enemies isn't just a rule we have on us now that we have to irrationally obey. Maybe we'd actually love the enemy. It'd be like if my son went crazy and broke into the house and was going to kill my wife and daughter. Well, you know what? I'm going to do everything I can to stop that from happening, because I love my wife and my daughter. But you know what? I also love my son. And I'm going to do whatever I can to keep him from being harmed. You see, the equation's different once you love all the parties involved. And that's what makes us creative. Wow. All of a sudden you start thinking of all these possibilities. I'm taking violence off the table. And so now what is possible? And now you're given the chance for the Holy Spirit to intervene. You might, maybe Lord can sometimes give people a word of knowledge. You can do something surprising to alter the situation. I mean, there's a lot of third-way responses to this, but it doesn't involve killing him or letting him kill anybody.
Yeah, great. That was so good. Wonderful. Appreciate that. So nothing is going to stop the advance of God's kingdom. And you touched on earlier that there's lots of good things happening in the world. And as I look at the world, if we get out of the siloing and the echo chambers, we see there's a lot getting better in the world. History shows us that. And there's plenty of good things happening. But as the church, if we're to continue to be a voice of hope in the 21st century, so the world hears in our language and our attitudes, that we're echoing the language of hope and an attitude of hope. How do we continue to do that in a healthy way? What are the main things? I mean, you've touched on some of this, I guess, already. What should be the emphasis of the church? What should be the emphasis of me as a church leader right now, today, and for the future, so that future generations have got something to build on that is filled with hope and not and filled with optimism, I guess.
Sure. One thing, and maybe this is the main thing, but right now, and we did touch on this a little bit earlier, but I think we've just had, as I look at the church in America now, and that's the one that I'm up closest to, but we so love our opinions, and we have so little to show for it. It's like we have so much emphasis on having the right ideas and right idea of what government should do, what's the right ideas about doctrine, right ideas about this, and if you don't agree, you're a liberal, you're a this, you're a that, and all that other craziness. I think our emphasis should be on just doing the kingdom. stop trying to fix the world. The church got off, got into Christendom once it starts trying to run the world. But look, individually and for a church body as a whole, look around and ask, what are some needs that we could meet? And that's what Jesus did. He walked around and met, brought the love of God to wherever he went. You need some healing. You need some food. You need some company. You need and he just met needs. Well, just ask the question, where are there needs in your community that you can start to meet? Just start loving people. Don't ask the question, what should government do? Our job doesn't have the right opinion about what government should do. Our job is just to do it in the power of the Spirit and for the glory of God. Yeah. So don't fight over what government should do about the school. Go to the school and say, what can our church do for you? Or whatever, in your neighborhood, whatever can use any kind of help, any kind of love, any kind of wisdom. Be there for the people. And then the Spirit will open up doors of opportunity to grow the kingdom, advance the kingdom. I really believe in the mustard seed principle. Grow small. It's the love is found in the little things. So the big pizzazz, wow, crusade. Let's get small and personal and care for the least of these. Where are there people who are ignored, people who don't have anyone to have dinner with on Thanksgiving and Christmas? And can we invite them in? Can we be radically hospitable? Just reach out to communities that are invisible, like this disabled community. Where can you manifest that cross-like love? That's our whole job right there.
Yeah, powerful, and that responsibility is with every one of us, not just the church leader, but every believer following the way of Christ. It's our responsibility to model that, and as we all do that together, the kingdom is going to advance profoundly. Yeah.
If a fraction of professing Christians took seriously, Gandhi actually said this. He wasn't even a Christian, but he goes, if a fraction of Christians took Jesus' teaching seriously and lived it out, the whole world would convert to Christianity overnight. It's just so beautiful and attractive. Yeah. So just start living that beautiful, attractive life in every way, shape, and form you can. Do it in community with others as much as possible. And that's how we begin to make a splash for the kingdom.
Beautiful. Greg, thanks so much. I really appreciate your time in chatting to us. And I know a lot of Aussies probably are not familiar with you. I have friends who have read your material. My son in Sydney loves your books. So, but again, thank you. We appreciate you. We appreciate what you bring. We appreciate who you are, because it's so evident in your teaching that you're not just teaching theology, but Greg comes out and the heart of Christ comes out through that. So we really appreciate that.
Well, I'm honored to have any kind of influence for you kingdom builders down under, so keep up your good kingdom work out there.
Yeah.
You're doing great.
And hopefully when this pandemic period's over, we've been to the US a couple of times, we might make it up into the Northeast, into your area up there, but it would be in the summer, because my wife she said straight out, I am not going to Minnesota in the winter. It's not.
I don't blame her. Yeah. I don't blame her.
All right. Blessings, Greg. Grace to you, my friend.
You too. God bless. Take care.
God bless.
Bye-bye.